The amber glow of oil lamps cast dancing shadows across the rough-hewn walls of the Silver Dollar Saloon, their flickering light catching the swirling cigarette smoke that hung heavy in the evening air. Clara Mayfield stood at the edge of the small wooden stage, her emerald dress catching what little light the lamps offered, her dark auburn hair pinned back in simple elegance that seemed almost out of place in the dusty mining town of Dry Creek. She had been dancing here for nearly 2 years now, ever since the silver mine had brought enough rough men and quick money to sustain a place like the Silver Dollar. The work paid better than anything else a woman could find in this corner of Nevada territory. And Clara needed every penny she could earn. Her mother, Sarah, lay bedridden with consumption back in the farming settlement of Cedar Falls, 3 days' ride east, and the doctor's bills seemed to grow heavier with each passing month. Clara knew what the townspeople whispered about her. She saw it in the way the shopkeeper's wife averted her eyes when Clara came to buy supplies, heard it in the hushed conversations that stopped abruptly when she walked past on the wooden sidewalks. They called her a fallen woman, a saloon girl no better than those who worked the cribs behind the main street. But Clara had drawn her own lines, invisible boundaries that she guarded as carefully as a prospector guards his claim. She danced, yes, and she served drinks to the miners and drifters who filled the saloon each night. She listened to their stories, laughed at their jokes when they weren't too crude, and accepted their tips with a practiced smile that never quite reached her eyes. But when the evening grew late and the men grew bold, when hands began to wander and suggestions turned explicit, Clara found ways to slip away, to disappear into the back room where she helped Martha, the saloon's cook, clean glasses and count the night's earnings. The arrangement with Henry Dobson, the Silver Dollar's owner, was simple enough. Clara danced 6 nights a week, served drinks, and kept the customers happy with her presence. In return, she received room and board in the small quarters above the saloon, plus a portion of the tips and a modest weekly wage. It wasn't the life she had dreamed of as a girl, but it was honest work in its own way, and it kept her mother's creditors at bay. Tonight, however, something felt different. Clara could sense it in the way Henry kept glancing toward the batwing doors, in the nervous energy that seemed to crackle through the saloon like electricity before a thunderstorm. Even the usual crowd of miners seemed subdued, their laughter forced and their conversations muted. As Clara finished her evening performance to scattered applause, she noticed Henry beckoning her from behind the bar. His weathered face, usually animated with the jovial spirit of a man who made his living entertaining others, was drawn tight with worry. She made her way through the crowd, dodging the reaching hands of a drunk cowboy and sidestepping a card game where tempers were already running high. "Clara, girl," Henry said in a low voice, leaning across the bar so only she could hear. "We need to talk. Come to the back room when you can manage it." The request sent a chill down Clara's spine. In all her time at the Silver Dollar, Henry had never called for a private conversation with such urgency. She nodded and continued serving drinks for another hour, going through the motions while her mind raced with possibilities, none of them pleasant. When the crowd finally began to thin, and the night air carried the promise of dawn still hours away, Clara slipped into the back room where Henry waited with a glass of whiskey clutched in his trembling hands. Martha sat beside him, her usually rosy cheeks pale with concern. "Sit down, child," Martha said gently, patting the wooden chair beside her. "Henry's got something to tell you, and it ain't good news." Henry took a long pull from his glass before speaking. "Clara, you know that loan I took out last year to fix the roof and buy new tables?" Clara nodded. She remembered the weeks when workmen had hammered overhead during the day, when the saloon had operated under canvas tarps during several rainstorms. "Well, the man I borrowed from, he ain't like the bankers in Carson City. His name's Silas Crow, and he's got a reputation for collecting debts in ways that don't always involve money." The name Silas Crow was familiar to Clara, whispered in fearful tones around town. She had heard stories of businesses that had failed to meet their payments, of men who had disappeared into the desert, of women who had been forced into situations no decent person would speak of openly. "How much do you owe him?" Clara asked, though part of her already dreaded the answer. "More than I can pay," Henry admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "The mine's been producing less silver, and the men ain't spending like they used to. I've been scraping together what I can, but it ain't enough. Crow sent word today that he's coming to collect, and if I can't pay—" Henry's voice trailed off, but Martha finished the thought with grim certainty. "He said he'd take something else instead, something Henry values just as much as money." The implication hit Clara like a physical blow. She had heard similar stories from other towns, other establishments where Crow held debts. Women who had vanished from their ordinary lives, only to reappear months later in the brothels of distant cities, broken and hollow-eyed. "When is he coming?" Clara managed to ask, surprised by how steady her own voice sounded. "Tomorrow night," Henry said. "Maybe the night after. His man wasn't specific, just said soon." Clara stood up slowly, her mind already working through possibilities. She could run, of course, take what money she had saved and disappear into the vast territory that stretched beyond Dry Creek. But that would leave her mother without support, and it would abandon Henry and Martha to face Crow's wrath alone. "There has to be another way," she said. "Maybe if we went to the sheriff." Martha's bitter laugh cut through the air. "Sheriff Hawkins owes Crow money, too. Child, half the businesses in town do. Crow's got this place sewn up tighter than a tick on a hound dog." Clara felt the walls of the small room closing in around her, the weight of her circumstances pressing down like the heavy Nevada heat. She thought of her mother, waiting in that small farmhouse for the medicine that Clara's earnings provided. She thought of Henry and Martha, who had given her shelter and honest work when she had nowhere else to turn. "I won't run," she said finally. "Whatever happens, we'll face it together." But even as she spoke the words, Clara felt a cold dread settling in her stomach like a stone. She had heard enough stories about Silas Crow to know that facing him might mean sacrificing everything she had fought so hard to protect. As she climbed the narrow stairs to her small room above the saloon, she tried to pray, but the words seemed to stick in her throat like dust from the desert wind. Outside her window, the town of Dry Creek settled into uneasy sleep, unaware that their quiet community was about to become the stage for a confrontation that would change everything for the young woman who danced in the Silver Dollar Saloon. The woman who had drawn her own lines in the sand and now found herself preparing to defend them against a man who recognized no boundaries at all. The midday sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty main street of Dry Creek, sending heat waves shimmering up from the packed earth like ghostly dancers. Clara had barely slept the night before, her mind churning with worry about Silas Crow's impending arrival. She stood at the window of her small room above the Silver Dollar, watching the familiar rhythm of the town below. Miners heading to their claims, shopkeepers sweeping their storefronts, children chasing a mangy dog between the hitching posts. It was then that she noticed him. The stranger rode into town on a horse as black as midnight, its coat gleaming despite the dust that covered everything else in Dry Creek. The rider sat tall in his saddle, moving with the easy confidence of a man who had spent more years on horseback than on foot. Even from her second-story window, Clara could see he was larger than most men, broad-shouldered and solid, wearing a well-worn brown hat pulled low over his eyes. What struck her most was the way he moved, deliberate and unhurried, but with an alertness that suggested he was taking note of everything around him. This wasn't a man who rode into towns carelessly. His dark eyes, visible even from her distance, swept the street methodically, cataloging faces, noting the positions of buildings, marking potential exits. The stranger guided his horse to the hitching post outside the Silver Dollar and dismounted with fluid grace. Clara watched as he removed his hat briefly, revealing dark hair that needed cutting and a face weathered by sun and wind. There were lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into vast distances, and something in his bearing suggested he had seen more than his share of trouble. Clara retreated from the window as the stranger's boots echoed on the wooden steps leading to the saloon's entrance. She could hear Henry greeting him below, offering the standard welcome given to any paying customer. By the time she made her way downstairs to help with the afternoon shift, the stranger had settled at a corner table with a glass of water and a modest meal of bread and stew. "Afternoon, miss," he said politely as Clara approached with a fresh pitcher of water. His voice was deep and measured, carrying the hint of an accent she couldn't quite place. Perhaps Texas, or maybe Colorado territory. "Good afternoon," Clara replied, refilling his glass. "I don't believe I've seen you in Dry Creek before, Mr. Carter," the man said, touching the brim of his hat. "Eli Carter. And no, ma'am, I'm just passing through. Heard there might be work for a man who knows his way around cattle." Clara studied him more closely as she worked. Eli Carter didn't look like the typical drifters who wandered through Dry Creek. His clothes were worn but well-maintained. His gun belt sat comfortable on his hips without the flashy ornamentation that marked wannabe gunslingers. And there was something in his manner that suggested both competence and restraint. "You might try the Double B Ranch," Clara suggested. "About 10 miles north of town, mister. Brennan's always looking for experienced hands." Eli nodded his thanks, but Clara noticed his attention wasn't really focused on talk of ranch work. Those dark eyes of his continued their subtle surveillance of the saloon, noting the other patrons, the layout of the room, the various entrances and exits. It was the behavior of a man who had learned to be cautious, someone who had survived by being prepared for trouble. As the afternoon wore on, more men filtered into the Silver Dollar. The usual crowd of miners finishing their shifts, a few cowboys from nearby ranches, and several travelers who had stopped in Dry Creek to rest their horses and wet their throats. Clara moved among them with practiced efficiency, serving drinks and deflecting the more persistent advances with a skill born of long experience. She noticed that Eli Carter watched these interactions with quiet interest, not the leering attention of men looking for entertainment, but something more thoughtful. When Jake Morrison, a miner known for his rough hands and rougher mouth, cornered Clara near the bar and made a suggestion that brought color to her cheeks, Eli's jaw tightened slightly, though he made no move to intervene. Clara handled the situation as she always did, with a firm but diplomatic refusal that sent Morrison back to his table, grumbling but not truly offended. It was a delicate balance she had learned to maintain, keeping the customers happy while protecting her own dignity. But she was aware of Eli Carter's continued observation, and, for some reason, his attention didn't make her uncomfortable the way other men's scrutiny did. As the afternoon shadows began to lengthen, Clara overheard a conversation that made her blood run cold. 3 men at a table near the window were discussing Silas Crow in voices they thought were too low to carry, but Clara's ears had become attuned to picking up such whispers. "Heard Crow's riding in tomorrow." One of them was saying, "Got business with Dobson, they say." "Poor bastard." Another replied, "Should have known better than to borrow from Crow. That man don't just collect money, he collects whatever he fancies." The third man, a grizzled prospector named Tom Walsh, shook his head grimly. "Word is he's got his eye on something particular this time, something pretty that dances on that little stage." Clara's hand trembled as she set down the glasses she was carrying, the slight clink of glass on wood barely audible over the general noise of the saloon. But Eli Carter heard it. She saw his head turned slightly in her direction, saw those observant eyes note her pale complexion and the way she steadied herself against the bar. For a moment, their gazes met across the smoky room. In that brief exchange, Clara felt as though this stranger was looking directly into her soul, seeing the fear she was trying so hard to hide, understanding the danger that circled her like wolves around a campfire. There was something in his expression, not pity, which she would have hated, but a kind of recognition, as if he understood what it meant to be trapped by circumstances beyond one's control. Eli Carter finished his meal and left a coin on the table that was more than generous for what he had ordered. As he stood to leave, he paused beside the bar where Clara was wiping down glasses with hands that still shook slightly. "Miss," he said quietly, his voice pitched for her ears alone. If you don't mind me saying, this seems like the kind of town where a person might want to be extra careful about the company they keep. Clara looked up at him, surprised by the gentle warning in his tone. I appreciate your concern, Mr. Carter, but I can take care of myself. I'm sure you can, Eli replied, settling his hat on his head. But sometimes even capable people find themselves in situations where they could use a friend. If that time comes, I'll be staying at the boarding house across the street. With that, he touched his hat brim politely and walked out into the dusty street, leaving Clara staring after him with a mixture of confusion and something that might have been hope. Through the window, she watched him lead his black horse to the livery stable, moving with that same deliberate care she had noticed when he first arrived. As evening approached and Clara prepared for another night of dancing and serving drinks, she found herself thinking about the stranger's words. In all her time in Dry Creek, no one had offered help without expecting something in return. Men made promises and propositions, but they always came with a price. Eli Carter's offer had sounded different somehow, genuine, without hidden motives. But Clara had learned to be wary of hope. In her experience, it was often the cruelest emotion of all, lifting you up only to let you fall harder when reality reasserted itself. Still, as she climbed the stairs to change into her evening dress, she couldn't help but glance across the street toward the boarding house where a stranger with kind eyes and careful ways had taken a room. Tomorrow would bring Silas Crow and whatever fate he had planned for her. But tonight, for the first time in weeks, Clara felt like she might not be facing that fate entirely alone. The thought was both comforting and terrifying in equal measure. The afternoon sun hung low in the western sky, casting long shadows across Dry Creek's main street when they arrived. Clara first noticed the sudden hush that fell over the Silver Dollar, the way conversations died mid-sentence and glasses paused halfway to lips. She looked up from the ledger she was reviewing behind the bar to see Henry's face drain of color as he stared toward the bat-wing doors. 4 men had entered the saloon, but it was immediately clear that only one of them truly mattered. Silas Crow moved with the confident swagger of a man who had never been told no and lived to remember it. He was not particularly tall, but there was something about his presence that seemed to fill the room, pushing against the walls like smoke from a poorly ventilated fire. His dark hair was slicked back with pomade, and his clothes were finer than anything seen in Dry Creek. A black suit that looked expensive even under the coating of trail dust. Polished boots that clicked against the wooden floor with each deliberate step. But it was his eyes that made Clara's skin crawl. They were pale blue, almost colorless, and they moved across the room with the calculating assessment of a man appraising livestock. When those eyes found Clara behind the bar, they lingered with an intensity that made her feel as though she needed to wash herself clean. The 3 men who followed Crow were clearly hired muscle, the kind of men who settled disputes with fists and guns rather than words. The largest of them, a bear of a man with arms like tree trunks and scars crisscrossing his knuckles, took up position near the front door. The other 2, lean and quick-looking, spread out to cover the saloon's other exits. It was a practiced maneuver, the kind of positioning that spoke of experience in collecting debts from unwilling debtors. "Dobson," Crow said, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent saloon. "I believe we have business to discuss." Henry stepped forward on unsteady legs, his hands visibly trembling as he wiped them on his apron. "Mr. Crow, sir, I wasn't expecting you until tomorrow. I've found that surprise visits often yield the most honest conversations," Crow replied, a cold smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Now, shall we discuss your outstanding debt?" Clara watched the exchange with growing dread, acutely aware that every eye in the saloon was now focused on the drama unfolding before them. The usual patrons, miners, cowboys, travelers, sat frozen in their chairs, none willing to involve themselves in Silas Crow's business. She understood their reluctance. Men who crossed Crow had a way of disappearing into the vast Nevada desert, never to be seen again. "I have some of what I owe you," Henry said, reaching into his vest pocket with shaking fingers. "Not all of it, but it's a start. If you could just give me another month." Crow's laugh was like ice crackling on a winter pond. "Another month? Henry, my friend. We've been through this before. The terms of our agreement were quite clear. Payment in full, or equivalent compensation." The emphasis on those last two words sent a chill down Clara's spine. She had heard stories of what Crow considered equivalent compensation. Businesses seized, men forced into indentured servitude, women taken to settle debts their menfolk couldn't pay. The law in these remote territories was sparse and often corrupted by men with enough money and influence. And Silas Crow had both in abundance. "Please, Mr. Crow," Henry pleaded. "The mine's been producing less silver, and folks just don't have the money they used to. If you could just—" "The mine's difficulties are not my concern," Crow interrupted, his voice taking on a harder edge. "However, I am a reasonable man. I'm willing to accept alternative arrangements." Crow's pale eyes found Clara again, and this time his gaze was unmistakably predatory. "I've heard interesting things about your establishment, Dobson, particularly about the entertainment you provide." Clara felt the blood drain from her face as Crow began walking toward the bar, his movements deliberate and unhurried. She wanted to run, to flee through the back door and keep running until she reached the distant mountains, but her legs felt rooted to the floor. "Miss Mayfield, isn't it?" Crow said as he approached the bar. "I've heard you're quite the dancer, quite the performer." The way he said the word performer made Clara's skin crawl. There was an implication in his tone, a suggestion that her dancing was something more than the modest entertainment she provided for the Silver Dollar's customers. "I dance, yes," Clara managed to say, surprised that her voice came out steady. "Nothing more than that? Oh, I'm sure you're quite talented," Crow continued, leaning against the bar with casual familiarity. "The question is, how far does that talent extend? How willing are you to expand your repertoire?" From the corner of her eye, Clara noticed movement. Eli Carter was still sitting at his corner table, but his posture had changed, where before he had seemed relaxed, almost casual in his observation of the saloon's activities. Now there was a coiled tension in his frame, like a spring wound tight and ready to release. His dark eyes were fixed on Crow with an intensity that Clara found oddly comforting. "I don't understand what you're suggesting," Clara said, though they both knew she understood perfectly. Crow's smile widened, revealing teeth that were too white and too sharp. "I think you understand very well. My dear, you see, your employer here has found himself in quite the predicament. He owes me a considerable sum of money, and he lacks the means to pay it. However, I'm willing to consider alternative forms of compensation." He reached across the bar and touched Clara's hand with fingers that felt cold and dry as snakeskin. "You could work off Mr. Dobson's debt. I have several establishments that would benefit from your talents. Establishments where a beautiful young woman could earn quite a substantial income." Clara jerked her hand away as if she had been burned. "I won't do that. I won't go with you." "Won't?" Crow's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than any shout. "My dear girl, I don't think you understand the gravity of the situation. Mr. Dobson's debt must be paid, one way or another. If not with money, then with something of equivalent value." He gestured around the saloon with proprietary confidence. "This establishment, for instance, would make a fine addition to my holdings. Of course, if I were to take over the Silver Dollar, there would be no need for Mr. Dobson's services, or yours, for that matter. At least, not in your current capacity." The threat was clear as crystal. Crow would seize the saloon and force Clara into a far worse situation than the one she currently faced. Henry would lose everything, and Clara would find herself trapped in one of Crow's brothels with no hope of escape or rescue. "You can't do this," Clara said, though even as she spoke the words, she knew how hollow they sounded. "Can't I?" Crow asked with a mock surprise. "I think you'll find that I can do whatever I please in this territory. Sheriff Hawkins is a reasonable man who understands the importance of maintaining good relationships with his creditors." Clara's heart sank as she realized the full extent of Crow's influence. If even the sheriff was in his pocket, there was no legal recourse, no protection for people like Henry and herself. However, Crow continued, I'm prepared to be generous. Come with me willingly. And Mr. Dobson keeps his saloon. Work for me for, say, 2 years, and his debt will be considered paid in full. Refuse, and I'll take everything he owns and still have you in the end. The choice, my dear, is entirely yours. The saloon remained deathly quiet. The only sounds the ticking of the clock on the wall and the distant sound of wind whistling through the gaps in the building's weathered boards. Clara felt the weight of every gaze in the room, the pity and fear of men who wanted to help but dared not risk their own necks against Silas Crow's power. But from his corner table, Eli Carter watched with eyes that held neither pity nor fear. Instead, there was something else in his gaze, a cold calculation that matched Crow's own, and beneath it, a simmering anger that promised consequences for any man who would prey upon the innocent. Clara straightened her shoulders and looked Silas Crow directly in the eye. I need time to think. Time? Crow laughed again. My dear girl, time is a luxury you can't afford. I'll need your answer before I leave town tomorrow morning. As he turned to go, Crow paused and looked back at Clara with those pale, predatory eyes. Do try to make the right choice, Miss Mayfield. It would be such a shame if this had to become unpleasant. With that warning hanging in the air like gun smoke, Silas Crow and his men walked out of the Silver Dollar, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than the desert heat outside. The silence that followed Silas Crow's departure stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Clara stood frozen behind the bar, her hands gripping the polished wood so tightly her knuckles had turned white. The usual sounds of the Silver Dollar, the clink of glasses, the shuffle of cards, the low murmur of conversation, had died completely, leaving only the harsh tick of the wall clock marking the seconds until her world would irrevocably change. Henry slumped against the bar beside her, his face ashen and his breathing shallow. The weight of what had just transpired seemed to have aged him a decade in the span of minutes. Martha emerged from the kitchen, her flour-dusted apron clutched in trembling hands, her eyes wide with the same fear that Clara felt clawing at her chest. Dear Lord, Henry whispered, his voice barely audible. What have I done? What have I brought down on us all? Clara reached out and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, though she felt anything but steady herself. This isn't your fault, Henry. You were trying to keep the saloon running, trying to make an honest living. You couldn't have known. But even as she spoke the comforting words, Clara's mind was racing through her limited options. She could run, pack what few belongings she owned, and disappear into the vast territory beyond Dry Creek. But that would leave Henry to face Crow's wrath alone, and it would cut off the only source of income that kept her mother alive back in Cedar Falls. She could stay and submit to Crow's demands, sacrifice herself to save Henry's livelihood. The thought made her stomach turn, but she had heard enough stories about Crow's establishments to know that such a choice would likely mean never seeing her mother again, never knowing freedom again. Or she could fight. But what chance did one young woman have against a man with Crow's resources and ruthlessness? The saloon's patrons began to drift away one by one, their drinks abandoned and their conversations forgotten. No one wanted to be associated with the Silver Dollar when Silas Crow returned to collect what he considered his due. Clara watched them go with a mixture of understanding and bitter disappointment. These were not bad men, most of them, but they had families and livelihoods of their own to protect. Only Eli Carter remained, still seated at his corner table with the remains of his meal pushed aside. He had ordered another glass of water and seemed content to sit quietly, occasionally glancing toward the bar where Clara stood wrestling with her impossible choice. His presence was oddly comforting, though Clara couldn't quite understand why. As the afternoon wore on, the saloon grew increasingly empty. By evening, when Clara would normally be preparing for her dance performance, only a handful of the most loyal customers remained. Even they seemed subdued, speaking in hushed tones and avoiding direct eye contact with Clara, as if her impending fate might somehow be contagious. Henry had retreated to his office behind the bar, where Clara could hear him pacing back and forth like a caged animal. Martha busied herself in the kitchen, the clatter of pots and pans providing a nervous soundtrack to the tense atmosphere. Clara found herself going through the motions of her evening routine, wiping down tables, checking the oil in the lamps, arranging glasses behind the bar, anything to keep her hands busy and her mind from dwelling on what tomorrow would bring. It was just after sunset when Crow returned, accompanied by the same 3 men who had flanked him earlier. The big man took up his position by the front door, while the other 2 spread out as before, effectively sealing the saloon. But this time, their presence felt more ominous, less like a business call and more like a capture operation. Crow himself looked supremely confident as he approached the bar, his pale eyes gleaming with anticipated victory. He had changed clothes since the afternoon, trading his dusty traveling attire for a fresh black suit that made him look like an undertaker come to measure corpses. "Miss Mayfield," he said with mock courtesy, touching the brim of his hat. "I trust you've had time to consider my generous offer?" Clara forced herself to meet his gaze, though every instinct screamed at her to look away. "I have." "Excellent. And your decision?" Before Clara could answer, Henry emerged from his office, his face set with grim determination. "Mr. Crow, perhaps we could discuss other arrangements. I could sign over a percentage of the saloon's profits, or..." "The time for negotiation has passed. Dobson." Crow cut him off with icy finality. "I've made my terms clear. The young lady comes with me, or I take everything you own and still claim her in the end." Clara felt the walls closing in around her, the weight of impossible choices pressing down like a physical force. She looked around the saloon that had been her home for 2 years, at Henry and Martha, who had given her shelter and honest work, at the few remaining customers who sat in uncomfortable silence. Her gaze fell on Eli Carter, still seated at his corner table, and for a moment their eyes met. In that brief connection, Clara saw something that gave her a spark of desperate hope, not pity or helpless sympathy, but a steady resolve that promised he would not simply stand by and watch injustice unfold. Without fully understanding why she was doing it, Clara began moving toward the end of the bar. Perhaps she intended to walk past Crow to the front door, to step outside and try to run. Perhaps she hoped to reach the back exit before his men could stop her. But as she moved, Crow stepped sideways to block her path, his hand reaching out to grasp her wrist. He said with that cold smile. "I think it's time we had a frank discussion about your future. My dear." Clara tried to pull away, but Crow's grip was stronger than she had expected. She found herself being guided toward a table near the center of the saloon, where his presence would be most visible to anyone thinking of interfering. "Sit," Crow commanded, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to obedience. Clara remained standing, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was acutely aware of the 3 hired men positioned around the saloon, of Henry's helpless expression, of Martha wringing her hands by the kitchen door. The trap had closed completely around her. It was then that her path brought her near Eli Carter's table. As she passed close enough to touch his shoulder, Clara felt a desperate plan forming in her mind. It was reckless, probably foolish, but it was the only chance she could see. She slowed her steps as she drew alongside his chair, her voice dropping to barely more than a whisper. The words came out in a rush, so quiet that only someone sitting directly beside her could have heard them. "Take my hand," she breathed, the words carrying all the desperation and hope she could muster. "Please." It wasn't a request for romantic attention or flirtation. It was a plea for help, a cry for rescue from someone who might have the strength and skill to stand against Silas Crow. Clara had no reason to trust this stranger, no guarantee that he would even understand what she was asking. But something in his manner, the careful way he observed everything around him, the controlled tension in his bearing, suggested he might be capable of more than he appeared. For a heartbeat that seemed to stretch into eternity, Eli Carter looked up at her with those dark, assessing eyes. Clara saw him take in her pale complexion, her trembling hands, the barely controlled fear that she was fighting so hard to conceal. She saw recognition dawn in his expression, the understanding that this was not a game or a performance, but a genuine plea for salvation. Then, with movements that seemed almost casual to any observer, Eli Carter pushed back his chair and stood up. His large hand closed around Clara's fingers with gentle strength. And for the first time since Crow had walked into the Silver Dollar, Clara felt like she might not be facing her fate entirely alone. "I think the lady and I will be stepping outside for some air," Eli said in a voice that carried clearly across the suddenly tense saloon. Crow's pale eyes narrowed dangerously. "I'm afraid that won't be possible. Miss Mayfield and I have business to conclude." "Well," Eli replied with deceptive mildness, his hand still holding Clara's as he guided her toward the back of the saloon, "I reckon that business can wait a few minutes." The three hired men began to shift position, their hands moving instinctively toward their weapons. But Eli's movements remained unhurried, almost casual, as he led Clara past the bar toward the rear exit. There was something in his bearing that gave even Crow's men pause, a confidence that suggested he was not nearly as helpless as he appeared. "Stop right there," Crow commanded, his voice sharp with authority and growing anger. But Eli Carter had already pushed open the back door of the Silver Dollar, and desert air rushed in to cool the overheated atmosphere of the saloon. Clara found herself being guided through that doorway into the gathering darkness beyond, her heart pounding with terror and hope in equal measure. Behind them, she could hear Crow's voice rising in fury, could hear the scrape of chairs and the heavy footsteps of men preparing to give chase. But for the moment, she was free of that suffocating room, free of those pale, predatory eyes. And she was not alone. The stranger who had answered her desperate plea was leading her into the night, and whatever came next. Clara knew that her life had just taken a turn toward either salvation or disaster. The moment they stepped through the back door of the Silver Dollar, Eli's casual demeanor vanished like smoke in a desert wind. His grip on Clara's hand tightened as he pulled her swiftly across the narrow alley behind the saloon, his eyes scanning the darkening landscape with the practiced efficiency of a man who had survived by reading danger in shadows. "Can you ride?" he asked tersely, already knowing that their escape depended entirely on speed and distance. "Yes," Clara replied breathlessly, her heart hammering so hard she was certain Eli could hear it. Behind them, the saloon erupted in angry voices and the crash of overturned furniture. Crow's bellowed commands cut through the evening air like whip cracks, followed by the heavy thud of boots on wooden floors as his men scrambled to pursue them. Eli led Clara at a dead run toward the livery stable at the end of the alley. The elderly stable-keeper, awakened by the commotion, poked his head out of his quarters above the barn, but one look at Eli's grim expression sent him scurrying back inside without a word. Some things in frontier towns were better left unseen and unremembered. Midnight, Eli's black stallion nickered softly as they approached his stall. The horse seemed to sense the urgency in his master's movements, standing perfectly still as Eli threw the saddle across his back with practiced efficiency. Clara watched in amazement as Eli's hands worked with lightning speed, tightening straps and adjusting stirrups with movements so fluid they seemed almost choreographed. "They'll be coming around the building any second," Eli muttered, leading Midnight from the stall. "I'm going to lift you up first, then mount behind you. When I do, hold on tight and don't look back." Clara nodded, her mouth too dry for speech, as if summoned by his words. The sound of running footsteps echoed from the mouth of the alley. Crow's voice rose above the others, sharp with fury and the promise of violence. "Find them! Check every building, every hiding place. I want them both brought back alive. But if they resist—" Eli placed his hands around Clara's waist and lifted her onto Midnight's back as easily as if she weighed no more than a child. The stallion shifted slightly under the unfamiliar weight, but remained steady as Eli swung up behind her, his arms coming around to grasp the reins. "Hold on," he whispered against her ear. And then they were moving. Midnight exploded from the stable like a coiled spring released. his powerful hooves striking sparks from the rocky ground behind the livery. Eli guided the horse away from the main street, taking a winding path between abandoned mining equipment and weathered shacks that would keep them hidden from immediate view. The first gunshot cracked through the night air just as they cleared the edge of town, the muzzle flash briefly illuminating the figures of Crow's men as they spread out in pursuit. Clara flinched at the sound, but Eli's arms tightened reassuringly around her as he urged Midnight to greater speed. "They're shooting to scare us, not to kill," he said, his voice remarkably calm given their circumstances. "Crow wants you alive, and he won't risk hitting you in the dark." They rode hard across the open desert, Midnight's stride eating up ground with the steady rhythm of a horse bred for distance and endurance. Behind them, Clara could hear the thunder of pursuing hooves, but the sounds seemed to be growing fainter rather than closer. Whatever else could be said about Silas Crow, he had not invested in horses that could match the quality of Eli's stallion. As they put distance between themselves and Dry Creek, Eli began to vary their path, following dry creek beds and rocky outcroppings that would make tracking difficult in daylight and nearly impossible in darkness. He rode with the confidence of a man who knew this country intimately, navigating by starlight and instinct through terrain that would have challenged even experienced trackers. "Who are you?" Clara finally managed to ask when they had slowed to let Midnight catch his breath. "You're not just a drifter looking for ranch work." Eli was quiet for a long moment, his eyes continuing to scan their back trail for signs of pursuit. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of old memories and carefully guarded secrets. "I used to work cattle," he said. "Still do, when the mood strikes me. But I've also done other work. Tracking, recovery of stolen property, sometimes bringing in men who didn't want to face justice in civilized towns. A bounty hunter." Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool desert air. She had heard stories of such men, hardened individuals who lived by violence and sold their services to whoever could pay their fees. But even as the thought crossed her mind, she remembered the gentle way Eli had responded to her plea, the careful consideration he had shown before agreeing to help her. "Why did you help me?" she asked. "You don't even know me." Eli guided Midnight down a steep slope toward what appeared to be an ancient riverbed, long since dried to dust and scattered stones. "I've seen enough of men like Crow to know what they do to people who can't defend themselves," he said simply. "Some things are worth standing against, regardless of the cost." They rode in silence for another hour, following the dry riverbed as it wound between towering rock formations that provided both cover and natural barriers against pursuit. The moon had risen, casting everything in silver light that transformed the harsh desert landscape into something almost beautiful. It was then that Clara began to speak, the words pouring out of her like water from a broken dam. She told Eli about her mother's illness, about the medical bills that had driven her to take work at the Silver Dollar. She explained Henry's desperate loan from Silas Crow, the trap that had slowly closed around them all, the impossible choice she'd faced between her own freedom and the survival of people she cared about. "I'm not what people think I am," she said, her voice barely audible over the sound of Midnight's hooves on stone. "I dance, yes, and I serve drinks. But I've always drawn my own lines, kept my own boundaries." "I know," Eli replied quietly. "I could see it in the way you carried yourself, the way you handled the men in the saloon. You're not what Crow tried to make you out to be." As the night wore on, they continued their steady progress across the desert, following paths that seemed to exist only in Eli's memory. Clara found herself growing drowsy despite the circumstances, lulled by the rhythmic motion of the horse and the steady warmth of Eli's presence behind her. She had been running on fear and adrenaline for so long that her body was finally beginning to acknowledge its exhaustion. "Sleep if you can," Eli said, as if reading her thoughts. "We have a long way to go before dawn, and you'll need your strength." "Where are we going?" Clara asked. "There's an old homestead about 20 miles from here," Eli explained. "Been abandoned for years, but the cabin's still sound and there's a well that still gives good water. We can rest there during the day, let Midnight recover, and decide what to do next." Clara wanted to ask more questions about his plans, about how they would deal with Crow's inevitable pursuit, about what would happen to Henry and Martha back in Dry Creek. But sleep was pulling at her with irresistible force, and she found her head drooping forward as exhaustion finally claimed her. The last thing she remembered before consciousness faded was the feeling of Eli adjusting his position to better support her weight, his strong arm coming around to steady her as she slept. For the first time in weeks, Clara felt truly safe, protected by this enigmatic stranger who had answered her desperate plea and asked for nothing in return. Behind them, the lights of Dry Creek had long since disappeared into the darkness, swallowed by distance and the vast emptiness of the Nevada desert. Ahead lay uncertainty and danger, but also the first real hope Clara had felt since Silas Crow had first cast his shadow over her life. Midnight carried them steadily through the night, his hooves marking a rhythm of escape and possibility across the ancient landscape, while overhead the stars wheeled in their eternal patterns, indifferent to the small human dramas playing out beneath their cold light, but in the warmth of shared trust and mutual protection. Clara and Eli had found something that even the vast indifference of the desert could not diminish, the simple human truth that sometimes, when darkness seems overwhelming, salvation can come from the most unexpected sources. The journey was far from over, but for now, they rode together into the unknown, two souls united by circumstance and choice, carrying with them the fragile hope that even the most impossible situations could be overcome by courage, determination, and the simple willingness to help a stranger in need. Clara awoke to the gentle sound of water trickling from a hand pump and the soft whicker of a horse drinking. For a moment, disorientation clouded her thoughts as she struggled to remember where she was and why her body ached from sleeping on hard ground. Then, memory came flooding back. Silas Crow, the desperate escape from Dry Creek, the long night ride across the desert with Eli Carter. She opened her eyes to find herself lying on a bedroll beneath the wooden overhang of what had once been a modest homestead. The cabin itself was weathered but sturdy, its log walls chinked with mud that had somehow survived years of desert wind and rain. A stone chimney rose from one end, and though the windows had long since lost their glass, wooden shutters hung at angles that suggested they might still provide some protection from the elements. Eli stood near the well, working the handle of an old pump while Midnight drank from a wooden trough that looked hand-carved. In the early morning light, Clara could see details about her rescuer that had been hidden by darkness and urgency. He was indeed a large man, broad-shouldered and tall, but he moved with a fluid grace that spoke of years spent in the saddle. His dark hair was longer than fashion dictated, curling slightly at the nape of his neck, and several days' worth of beard shadowed his jaw. What struck her most was the careful way he went about his morning tasks, checking Midnight's legs for injuries, examining the horse's hooves for stones, ensuring the animal was properly cared for before seeing to his own needs. It spoke of a man who understood that in this harsh country, the welfare of one's horse often meant the difference between life and death. "How long did I sleep?" Clara asked, sitting up and immediately regretting the movement as her muscles protested. "About 4 hours, Eli replied, not looking up from his examination of Midnight's front left hoof. "Sun's been up for maybe an hour. You needed the rest." Clara looked around at their surroundings with greater attention. The homestead sat in a small valley surrounded by red rock formations that would provide both concealment and defensive positions if needed. A few scrub trees struggled for life near the well, and the remains of what had once been a vegetable garden were still visible as lines of slightly greener earth. "Who lived here?" she asked. "Family named Morrison," Eli said, finally satisfied with Midnight's condition. "Tried to make a go of farming, but the land's too hard and the water too scarce. They pulled up stakes about 3 years ago. Headed back east to Ohio, I heard." He approached the cabin and pushed open the wooden door, which creaked on leather hinges but swung freely. "Should be safe enough for a day or two. Crow's men will have lost our trail in the rocky country we covered last night, but they'll be casting around looking for sign. Better if we stay put until they move their search elsewhere." Clara stood up carefully, working the stiffness from her joints as she followed Eli toward the cabin. The interior was sparse but clean, with a stone fireplace, a rough wooden table, and built-in bunks along one wall. Someone had left behind a few basic supplies: a coffee pot, some tin plates, a bag of beans that looked like they might still be edible. "We'll need to be careful about smoke during the day," Eli said, kneeling to examine the fireplace, "but after dark, we can risk a small fire for coffee and warmth." As they settled into their temporary refuge, Clara found herself studying Eli with growing curiosity. His movements were economical and purposeful, suggesting years of experience in situations where waste motion could prove fatal. Yet there was also a gentleness about him, particularly evident in how he had handled her during their escape and how he cared for his horse. "You said you've done tracking work," Clara said as Eli arranged their few supplies on the table. "You mean bounty hunting?" Eli nodded without evasion. "Among other things, sometimes a man has to take whatever work pays enough to keep body and soul together. Have you ever—" Clara paused, unsure how to phrase the question delicately. "Have you ever had to hurt people?" Eli's hands stilled in their work, and for a long moment he was silent. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of hard experience and carefully considered choices. "I've never killed a man who didn't try to kill me first," he said quietly. "And I've never brought in anyone who didn't deserve what they had coming. But yes, I've had to use violence when talking wouldn't suffice." Clara absorbed this information, trying to reconcile the gentle man who had responded to her plea with the dangerous profession he described. "What about Silas Crow? What will you do if he finds us?" "I'll do whatever I have to do to protect you," Eli replied with quiet certainty. "Crow's the kind of man who interprets mercy as weakness. If he comes for you, there won't be any talking our way out of it." As the morning progressed, they fell into an easy routine. Eli went hunting with a rifle he had carried in his saddle pack, returning with 2 rabbits that would provide fresh meat for their evening meal. Clara explored the abandoned homestead, finding remnants of the life the Morrison family had tried to build: a child's wooden toy horse, a woman's forgotten hair ribbon, the remains of a flower garden that someone had loved enough to water in this unforgiving climate. It was while tending to a small cut on Eli's hand, a scrape he had gotten while skinning the rabbits, that Clara first truly understood the man who had risked everything to help her. His hands were scarred and calloused from years of hard work, but they remained steady as she cleaned the wound with water from the well. "You don't have to do this," Eli said as she wrapped the cut with a strip of cloth torn from her petticoat. "It's just a scratch." "You've done so much for me," Clara replied, focusing on the simple task to avoid meeting his eyes. "It's the least I can do." As she worked, Eli began to talk about his past. He had been born in Colorado Territory, the son of a rancher who had lost everything to drought and falling cattle prices after his parents died of fever. Eli had drifted from job to job: cowhand, guide, occasional lawman in towns too small to attract experienced peace officers. "The bounty work started by accident," he explained. "I was working for a ranch near Denver when some rustlers made off with half the herd. The local sheriff couldn't be bothered to pursue them across territorial lines, so the ranch owner offered me a percentage of the cattle's value if I could bring them back. And you did. Took me 3 weeks, but yes. Found the rustlers holed up in an abandoned mine. Convinced them that facing a judge would be preferable to facing me in a gunfight. Word got around that I was good at finding people who didn't want to be found." Clara finished bandaging his hand and sat back on her heels. "Is that what you want to do for the rest of your life? Chase dangerous men across the wilderness?" Eli flexed his fingers, testing the bandage. "Honestly, I've been thinking it might be time for a change. There's only so long a man can live that kind of life before it starts eating at his soul." "What would you do instead?" For the first time since she had met him, Eli's expression softened into something approaching vulnerability. "I've been thinking about finding a piece of land somewhere, maybe raising some horses, building something instead of just hunting down what other people have lost or stolen." As the day wore on, Their conversation ranged from practical matters, how long they could safely remain at the homestead, what their options were for dealing with Crow's pursuit, to more personal subjects. Clara found herself sharing dreams she had never spoken aloud before. "I used to think about opening a small cafe," she said as they sat in the shade of the cabin's overhang, watching midnight graze on the sparse grass near the well. Somewhere clean and welcoming, where people could get a good meal and feel like they belonged. Not like the Silver Dollar, where everything feels temporary and a little bit desperate. "What would you call it?" Eli asked. Clara smiled. The first genuine smile she had managed in weeks. "Clara's Kitchen. Simple, but honest. I make excellent biscuits. And my mother taught me how to brew coffee that doesn't taste like it was made with creek water and old boots." "Sounds like the kind of place a man could feel at home," Eli said quietly. There was something in his tone that made Clara look at him more carefully. In the afternoon light, she could see that his dark eyes held depth she was only beginning to understand. This was not a simple man leading a simple life, but someone who had seen much of the world's cruelty and chosen to respond with kindness when it mattered most. As evening approached and Eli prepared to build a small fire for cooking, Clara realized that something fundamental had changed during their day of refuge. The desperate flight from Dry Creek had brought them together by chance and necessity, but the quiet hours at the abandoned homestead had created something deeper, a connection based on shared hopes and mutual respect. When Eli handed her a tin cup of coffee and their fingers briefly touched, Clara felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the hot liquid. For the first time in years, she was allowing herself to imagine a future that didn't involve constantly looking over her shoulder or counting pennies to pay for her mother's medicine. But even as hope began to bloom in her heart, Clara knew that their sanctuary was temporary, somewhere out there. Silas Crow was looking for them, and eventually, he would have to be faced. The question was whether she and Eli would face him together, and what that choice might cost them both. The messenger arrived on the third day of their refuge, a grizzled old prospector named Jeremiah Pike, who made his living carrying news and mail between the scattered settlements of the territory. Eli spotted him first, a distant figure riding a tired mule across the valley floor, and immediately moved to intercept him before he could approach the homestead directly. Clara watched from the cabin's doorway as the two men met near a stand of Joshua trees about a quarter-mile away. Even at that distance, she could see the tension in Eli's posture as he listened to whatever news Pike carried. When Eli finally returned, his expression was grim. "Crows put a bounty on us," he said without preamble. $500 for information leading to our capture, $1,000 for bringing us back alive. Clara felt her stomach drop. $1,000 was more money than most people in the territory saw in 5 years. What about Henry and Martha? Still alive, but Crow's taken over the Silver Dollar, turned it into the kind of establishment you'd expect. Eli's jaw tightened. Pike says the whole town's scared silent. Nobody wants to cross Crow, but nobody's happy about what he's done either. Clara sank into the wooden chair by the table, the weight of guilt pressing down on her shoulders like a physical burden. "This is all my fault. If I hadn't asked you to help me, if I'd just gone with him." "No." Eli's voice was sharp enough to cut through her self-recrimination. "Don't you dare blame yourself for that man's choices. Crow would have done exactly what he's doing whether you'd gone with him willingly or not. The only difference is you'd be suffering right alongside Henry and Martha instead of having a chance to fight back." "Fight back?" Clara looked up at him, seeing something new in his expression. A cold determination that reminded her he had once made his living tracking down dangerous men. "What are you thinking?" Eli was quiet for a long moment, staring out across the desert toward the distant mountains. "Pike brought more than just news. Seems there are wanted posters out on 2 of Crow's men, Buck Morrison and Snake Peterson. Territory's offering $500 apiece for them, dead or alive." Clara began to understand. "You want to go after them?" "Not them specifically. I want to go after Crow." Eli turned to face her, and she saw resolve hardening in his dark eyes like steel cooling in a forge. A man like that only understands one kind of language. We can keep running, keep hiding, but he'll never stop hunting us. The only way this ends is if we end it. But there are 4 of them, and you're just one man. I've faced worse odds." Eli's tone was matter-of-fact, as if he were discussing the weather rather than a potentially fatal confrontation. "Besides, I won't be going in unprepared. Crow's gotten comfortable, thinks he's won. That'll work in our favor." Clara stood and walked to the window, looking out at the peaceful valley that had sheltered them. The thought of leaving this sanctuary, of deliberately walking into danger, terrified her. But she also understood that Eli was right. They couldn't run forever, and as long as Silas Crow was free to pursue them, neither of them would ever truly be safe. "What do you need me to do?" Eli's expression softened slightly. "I need you to stay here, where it's safe. This isn't your fight. Like hell it isn't." Clara's voice carried more steel than she had known she possessed. "Crow came after me first. Henry and Martha are suffering because of debts tied to my employment, and you—" She paused, struggling to put her feelings into words. "You risked everything to help me. I won't hide while you face danger alone. Clara, this isn't going to be a conversation or a negotiation. If I'm right about Crow, it's going to end in violence. Then teach me to shoot." Eli stared at her for a long moment, clearly weighing her determination against the risks involved. "Finally," he nodded slowly. "If you're certain about this, then yes, I'll teach you. But you follow my lead completely, no matter what happens." "Understood." Clara nodded, though her heart was hammering with fear and anticipation. They spent the rest of the day in preparation. Eli produced a small pistol from his saddlebags, a Smith & Wesson revolver that he said he had taken from a prisoner years earlier. He taught Clara how to hold it properly, how to aim, how to squeeze the trigger without jerking the gun off target. Her first few shots went wild, the recoil stronger than she had expected, but by evening she was hitting a tin can at 20 paces more often than not. "Remember," Eli said as they sat by their small fire that night, "a gun is a tool, nothing more. It won't make you brave, and it won't solve problems by itself. But if everything goes wrong, if you're cornered with no other choice, don't hesitate. Crow's men won't show you mercy if you hesitate to defend yourself." They left the homestead before dawn, riding double on midnight toward Dry Creek. Eli had spent hours studying the terrain between their hiding place and the town, planning an approach that would bring them close without being seen. They would arrive in the late afternoon, when the sun would be behind them and the light would make it difficult for anyone in town to clearly see approaching riders. As they rode, Eli explained his plan. "Crow will be expecting us to run, to keep hiding. He won't be prepared for a direct confrontation. We go in fast, end it quickly, and get out before his remaining allies can organize. What about the townspeople? What if innocent people get caught in the crossfire? That's why we're doing this at sunset, when most folks will be home for dinner, and why we're going to make it clear from the start that this is between us and Crow." The closer they got to Dry Creek, the more Clara's nerves tightened. Part of her wanted to beg Eli to turn around, to find another way, to keep running until they reached some distant place where Silas Crow's influence couldn't reach them. But she also knew that such a life would be no life at all, always looking over their shoulders, never able to settle or build something lasting. When the buildings of Dry Creek appeared on the horizon, Eli guided Midnight to a ridge overlooking the town. From their vantage point, they could see the silver dollar clearly, and Clara's heart sank at the changes that had been made. The modest saloon she had called home for 2 years had been transformed into something garish and unwelcoming. New signs advertised services that made Clara's cheeks burn, and even from a distance, the establishment had an air of corruption that seemed to poison the very ground around it. "I can see 4 horses tied outside," Eli said, studying the scene through a small telescope. "That's probably Crow and his men, no sign of other customers, which is good for us." Clara watched as her former home grew larger and more detailed as they approached. She could see a movement in the windows, shadows that might have been people, but it was impossible to tell who was inside or what condition Henry and Martha might be in. "Are you ready?" Eli asked as they reached the edge of town. Clara checked the pistol tucked into her belt, ensuring it was secure but accessible. Her hands were steady, though her heart was racing. "I'm ready." Eli guided Midnight onto the main street of Dry Creek, riding slowly and deliberately toward the Silver Dollar. A few townspeople saw them coming and quickly disappeared into shops and houses. Recognizing the signs of impending trouble, word would spread quickly, but hopefully not quickly enough to warn Crow before they were ready. As they approached the saloon, Eli dismounted and helped Clara down. She could see faces in the windows now, could make out the figures of men moving around inside. Somewhere in that building, Silas Crow was waiting, probably confident that his intimidation tactics had worked, that the territory was his to control as he saw fit. "Last chance to change your mind," Eli said quietly. Clara looked at the Silver Dollar, thinking of all the dreams and fears those walls had witnessed, all the honest work and desperate hope that had played out within them. Then she thought of Henry and Martha, of her mother waiting for medicine in Cedar Falls, of the life she wanted to build instead of the one that had been forced upon her. "Let's end this," she said. Eli nodded and stepped onto the wooden sidewalk in front of the Silver Dollar. Clara followed, her hand resting on the pistol at her side, her heart hammering with fear and determination in equal measure. The bat-wing doors of the saloon swung open as they approached, and Silas Crow stepped out onto the sidewalk with that same cold smile Clara remembered from their first confrontation. Behind him came his 3 remaining men, their hands resting on their weapons. "Well, well," Crow said, his pale eyes glittering with anticipation. "I was wondering when you'd grow tired of hiding in the desert like animals. I must say, I'm impressed by your boldness, if not your intelligence." "It's over, Crow," Eli said, his voice carrying clearly down the empty street. "Release your claim on Miss Mayfield and leave this territory. This is your only warning." Crow's laugh was like ice cracking on a frozen pond. "I'm afraid that's not going to happen. Mr. Carter, you see, Miss Mayfield and I have an agreement to finalize, and you've become quite expensive to ignore." The confrontation Clara had dreaded was finally at hand, and as the sun began to set behind the buildings of Dry Creek, she realized that everything she had ever wanted in life hung in the balance of the next few minutes. The silence that stretched between Eli and Crow seemed to last forever, though it could only have been seconds. Clara felt every heartbeat like thunder in her chest as she watched the 2 men face each other in the dusty street of Dry Creek. The setting sun cast long shadows between the buildings, painting everything in shades of gold and crimson that seemed almost too beautiful for what was about to unfold. Then Eli moved. Clara had seen gunfighters before, had watched men draw their weapons in anger or desperation, but she had never witnessed anything like Eli Carter in action. His movement was so fluid, so economical, that it seemed almost casual, until his Colt appeared in his hand as if by magic, the barrel already trained on Silas Crow before the other man had cleared leather. The shot that followed was thunderously loud in the confined space of the street, echoing off the wooden buildings like a declaration of judgment. Crow's own weapon flew from his nerveless fingers as Eli's bullet shattered his wrist, sending him stumbling backward with a cry of pain and shock. The 3 hired men reacted with the desperation of cornered animals, their hands clawing for their guns even as they realized how thoroughly they had been outmatched. But Eli was already moving, his body flowing like water as he shifted position, his weapon tracking from target to target with deadly precision. 2 more shots rang out in rapid succession. Buck Morrison, the bear of a man who had guarded the saloon's front door, doubled over as Eli's bullet took him in the shoulder, his own gun clattering uselessly to the wooden sidewalk. Snake Peterson, trying to find cover behind a wooden post, screamed as the 3rd shot caught him in the leg, dropping him to the ground where he writhed in the dust. The 4th man, whose name Clara had never learned, proved smarter than his companions. Seeing his leader wounded and his partners down, he threw his hands up in surrender, his weapon still holstered. "Don't shoot," he called out, his voice cracking with fear. "I'm done. I'm out of this." The entire confrontation had lasted less than 30 seconds. Clara stood frozen on the sidewalk, her own pistol still unfired, staring in amazement at the scene before her. 3 of Crow's men were on the ground, wounded but alive, while their leader clutched his shattered wrist and glared at Eli with hatred that burned like acid. "You have no idea what you've done," Crow snarled, his face pale with pain and fury. "I have friends in Carson City, connections in San Francisco. You can't just—" "Your friends aren't here," Eli interrupted, his voice deadly calm as he kept his weapon trained on the wounded man. "And they won't be coming to help you. In fact, I suspect they'll be eager to distance themselves from your operations once word gets out about what you've been doing in these parts." As if summoned by the gunshots, people began emerging from the buildings along the street. Clara saw familiar faces among them, shopkeepers, miners, even Sheriff Hawkins, though he looked more relieved than concerned about the violence that had just occurred. And there, pushing through the gathering crowd, were Henry and Martha, both looking haggard but unharmed. "Clara!" Martha cried, rushing forward to embrace her. "Oh, child, we thought we'd never see you again." Henry followed more slowly, his face bearing the marks of strain and worry, but his eyes bright with hope for the first time in weeks. "Is it over?" he asked quietly. "Is he really finished?" "It's over," Eli confirmed, though he still kept his weapon ready. "Crow's done in this territory. I suspect once word of tonight reaches the right ears, he'll find his welcome worn out in a lot of places." Sheriff Hawkins approached with obvious reluctance, clearly torn between his duty as a lawman and his relief at seeing Silas Crow brought low. "There's going to have to be an investigation," he said uncertainly. "Questions about what happened here." "Of course," Eli replied, "though I suspect you'll find that Mr. Crow and his associates are wanted for various crimes in several territories. The bounties alone should cover any administrative costs." Clara watched as the wounded men were helped to the doctor's office, Crow still cursing and threatening even as he was led away. The 4th man, the one who had surrendered, was quietly gathering his belongings from the Silver Dollar, clearly eager to leave Dry Creek far behind. As the immediate aftermath settled, Clara found herself standing beside Eli in front of the saloon she had once called home. The building looked different somehow, as if Crow's presence had left a stain that would take time to wash clean. But it was still standing, still salvageable. "What will you do now?" she asked Henry, who was surveying the damage to his establishment with a mixture of sadness and determination. "Rebuild," he said simply. "Clean this place up. Make it respectable again. It'll take time, but Martha and I aren't ready to give up yet." "And you'll need help," Clara said, surprised to hear the words coming from her own mouth. "Running a proper establishment, keeping the books, making sure everything runs smoothly." Henry looked at her with surprise and growing hope. "Are you saying—" "I'm saying maybe it's time the Silver Dollar became something different, something better." Clara glanced at Eli, drawing strength from his encouraging nod. "I've been thinking about that cafe we talked about. Maybe it doesn't have to be somewhere else. Maybe it could be right here." The idea took shape as she spoke, becoming more real with each word. The Silver Dollar could be transformed from a rough saloon into a welcoming gathering place. Part restaurant, part coffee house, where families could come for good food and honest conversation. The stage where she had danced could become a platform for traveling musicians and storytellers. The bar could serve coffee and fresh-baked bread instead of rot-gut whiskey. "Clara's kitchen," Eli said quietly, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "Clara's kitchen," she agreed. As the days that followed proved, word of Crow's defeat spread quickly through the territory. The man himself, once his wounds had healed sufficiently, was escorted to the territorial capital to face charges related to several outstanding warrants. His remaining associates either fled the area or found themselves facing their own legal difficulties. More importantly for Clara, the bounties that Eli collected for bringing in wanted criminals provided enough money to not only pay off Henry's remaining debts, but also to fund the transformation of the Silver Dollar. Clara threw herself into the project with enthusiasm she hadn't felt in years, planning menus, arranging for new furnishings, and designing a space that would welcome honest families instead of desperate men. Eli, meanwhile, found himself with a new role that suited him better than the dangerous life he had been living. The territorial governor, impressed by his handling of the Crow situation, offered him a position as a federal marshal, work that would allow him to uphold justice without the moral ambiguity of bounty hunting. But it was the quiet moments between the grand plans and public recognition that mattered most to Clara. Evenings when she and Eli would sit on the front porch of the Silver Dollar, watching the sun set over the desert while they discussed their hopes for the future. Mornings when she would find him feeding midnight behind the building, his gentle care for the horse reflecting the same tenderness he showed in all his dealings with those he cared about. One evening, as they worked together to paint the new sign that would hang above the front door, Clara's kitchen, good food, good company. Clara found herself thinking about the journey that had brought them to this moment, from her desperate whisper in a crowded saloon to this peaceful evening preparing for a new kind of life. Everything had changed. "I never thanked you properly," she said as Eli carefully lettered the word kitchen in neat black script. "For what? For hearing me, for understanding what I needed when I asked you to take my hand." Eli set down his brush and turned to face her, his dark eyes serious. "I heard you because I recognized something in your voice, the sound of someone who wasn't ready to give up, even when everything seemed hopeless. And now I hear something different." He reached out and took her paint-stained hand in his own, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm. "I hear someone who's found her home." Clara looked around at the building they were transforming, at the town where she had struggled and survived and finally found peace. But most of all, she looked at the man who had answered her call for help and stayed to become something far more precious than a rescuer. "I'm home," she said, and felt the truth of it settle into her bones like warmth from a well-built fire. When Clara's kitchen opened 2 months later, it was everything Clara had dreamed it would be. The coffee was indeed excellent. The biscuits were legendary throughout the territory, and the atmosphere was welcoming to families, travelers, and anyone else who needed a place where they could feel like they belonged. Eli took his meals there every day, claiming it was the best food within 100 miles, but Clara suspected he came as much for the company as for the cooking, and she was perfectly content with that arrangement. On their wedding day, the following spring, Clara wore a simple blue dress and carried wildflowers picked from the hills around Dry Creek. As she placed her hand in Eli's before the traveling preacher who had agreed to perform the ceremony, she thought about that desperate night when she had whispered, "Take my hand," to a stranger in a crowded saloon. She had been asking for rescue then, for someone to lead her away from danger and despair. What she had found instead was a partner, someone who would stand beside her as she built the life she had always wanted. The hand that held hers now was steady and strong, calloused from honest work and gentle in its touch. It was the hand of a man who had learned that the greatest strength lay not in the ability to take what you wanted, but in the wisdom to protect what you loved. As they spoke their vows in the afternoon sunlight, with the scent of sage and desert flowers carried on the warm breeze, Clara understood that she had finally found what she had been searching for all along, not just safety or security, but a true home in the heart of a good man who had chosen to build a life with her rather than simply rescue her from the one she was leaving behind. The journey that had begun with a whispered plea in the darkness had led her to this moment of pure light, and Clara knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, she would never again have to face them alone. Retry Claude can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.